So we're going to end the semester talking about Luther and the Protestant Reformation, and it's kind of a nice way to wrap everything up since we started with the big three monotheistic faiths, and we're getting to the end of the medieval period, the end of the Middle Ages, and we're seeing the stronghold that the Catholic Church has on the Western world start to crumble. And I talked about the Black Death, and I talked about the Crusades back in that lecture about the medieval world. So those are some things that have sort of led to the church losing hold of its power, but we'll talk about some more of those things in this lecture, and we'll get a little more in depth about the Protestant Reformation. So to start, one of the things I mentioned back in that lecture on the medieval world was the monopoly that the Catholic Church had on the transmission of knowledge, right? Remember, because the people who were copying the books were the monks, and they were the ones who could basically control what was getting copied. The church was controlling what was getting copied, who was copying it, and who was getting access to it, right? So if you wanted a book in, let's say you're living in medieval France or something, first of all, if you were a peasant, you probably couldn't read. Second of all, books are not widely available to the public. Bibles are available to clergy members and stuff like that, but since they're hand copied, it's not like there are tons of copies running around. And that changes in 1435 when the printing press is invented by Gutenberg. This allows information to travel a lot faster, and it also takes the power of knowledge out of the hands of the church. So one of the reasons that the Protestant Reformation actually happens is because the knowledge and information is getting into the hands of people. So, the way that we can look at the questions of the Reformation, I have it broken down into three questions, and these are the questions that Martin Luther is going to basically change the answers to. So Catholicism has like these really clear answers provided for all of these questions, and Luther is going to challenge those answers and give us different ones. The first question is, how is a person supposed to be saved? So what does someone have to do basically to get into heaven, right? The second question is, where does religious authority reside? So we're talking about the Catholic Church. You're obviously talking about the Pope, right? And you're talking about bishops and archbishops and deacons and all of that stuff. Luther's going to change that answer too. The question of what the church is composed of is another question he's going to deal with, and the highest form of Christian life is sort of the big question that all of this is kind of wrapped up in. So these are if we're going to frame our discussion of the Reformation in a way, we might look at it this way. So just a reminder, by the Middle Ages, and we know this because we've read Aquinas, Catholic Christianity had established itself as the official religion of the West and of Central Europe under the power of the Pope, right? So we had the fall of the Roman Empire, and then we have the rise of what we call the Holy Roman Empire, right? But I think it's really obvious to see that anytime some entity gets too much power, absolute power breeds absolute corruption, right? And so the church, because it's getting big and because it's getting all this power, it's becoming really corrupt. And it's not like people aren't noticing. So one of the things we used to teach in this class is the Canterbury Tales. So that's a really good example of somebody who's critiquing the church. But that's not the only example we have. So by about the early 14th century, individuals started calling for reform against what they thought were these really corrupt practices of the Catholic Church. So you have people like John Wycliffe, and he's in England, and Jan Hus from Czechoslovakia, who are getting really angry at some of the practices, some of the official practices of the church, like selling indulgences, and letting people basically buy their way out of paying penance for sin and selling church offices, which we'll talk about here in a minute. And so this is sort of the climate in which Luther is coming about. People have criticized the church ahead of him, but he's the one who actually really gets everything sort of rolling. So Luther himself is born in now what we call the Saxony part of Germany. He's born into a really middle class family. He goes to monastery school just like Aquinas does, and he gets university degrees, and he's trained as a lawyer. But in 1505, he has this wacky conversion experience, and he's like narrowly missed by a lightning bolt or something, and he thinks that this is the voice of God reaching out to him. So he decides to give up being a lawyer. He enters an Augustinian order against his father's wishes, kind of like what happened with Aquinas, except he was trying to get with the Dominicans, right? And his parents were pissed about it, and they locked him in the castle. But Luther's parents don't do this to him, and he eventually becomes a professor of biblical theology at the University of Wittenberg. Luther is not just influenced by Catholicism, though, because of his education, right? He's had this secular education, so he has exposure to the philosophy of secular humanism, and coupled with his salvation make for a really interesting perspective on questions of church doctrine. So whereas Aquinas is trying to marry Aristotle with the Catholic Church, Luther's coming about this from a way more holistic perspective, I think. And he goes on a pilgrimage to Rome when he's first starting out, and what he notices is the excess of the church is just insane. Like he sees like these gold buildings and all of this money getting dumped into these beautiful cathedrals, and the garments that the Pope is wearing, and all of like the high-ranking church officials are living these really luxurious lives and drinking fancy wine, and you see these poor people basically dying on the streets of Rome near the Vatican, right? So he's going on this pilgrimage to the Church of St. Peter, which was commissioned to be built, and it's beautiful. It's really ornate and gorgeous. But Luther sees this, and he's like, this isn't what Jesus wanted. I don't think Jesus wanted us to spend all this money on beautiful churches. I think he wanted us to help the poor. So he writes this little pamphlet called the Senton Use in 1517, and then the story goes that he nailed these 95 theses to the door of the cathedral in Wittenberg. That probably isn't exactly true, but one time on a test, somebody wrote that he had stapled the 95 theses to the door, which really cracked me up. But anyway, he did something. He published these 95 theses, and this is a really extensive document where Luther expresses his disgust over some of the practices of the church, indulgences specifically. And so the basilica, the cathedral that he visited in Rome, St. Peter's, was paid for through the practices of indulgences. And so I'll talk about that on this list of the problems that Luther has with the church. These are the things that he's criticizing. First, he's criticizing what we call simony, and that's selling church offices to people. Basically, whoever had the most money could buy themselves an archbishopric. So if you wanted to be like a church official, you could pay somebody a lot of money and become one. He also didn't think that you should be allowed to hold multiple offices within the church. So that's a thing that he thinks is pretty sketchy. Indulgences are the big one, though. And this is where if you pay some money to the church, you could either avoid doing penance for one of your own sins. So I don't know how much you know about Catholicism, but basically when you sin, you have a punishment, right? You have to say extra prayers, or do extra Hail Marys on the rosary, or you take a pilgrimage, or you give some extra money to the poor, or whatever. But the idea of an indulgence was that you could buy your way out of having to be punished for committing this sin. Indulgences also include you being able to buy your dead relatives' way out of purgatory. So in Catholicism, there's heaven, which is where all the good, sinless people go, and then there's hell, which is where all the sinners go, and then there's this like kind of middle place that we call purgatory, where you either have to wait a really long time to be able to get into heaven, or you're basically just kind of you're stuck in the middle, right? So the idea behind an indulgence was that if you had dead relatives who were in purgatory, who you thought were in purgatory, right, or who the church said that they would go to purgatory when they died, you could buy their way out of it with an indulgence. Totally wacky. He's also really pissed about the level of corruption that's going on within the church. You have all of these really crazy things going on with the popes too, like the Avignon papacy. There's a time where there are 3 people who claim to be the pope at the same time, so that's kind of nutty. And in general, he's really upset about the level of power that the papacy holds, right? So he thinks that the pope as an individual should not have all this power. So I'll stop that one here, and then we'll continue with this one.